So greetings everyone, welcome to the first part of the multi-part lecture about Agile project management. My goal is to present you with quite the minimalistic approach for your GameLAB needs. However, last year we just talked about short-term planning and sprint level planning, and the biggest feedback was that people want to know more about roadmap level planning as well. So there's a bit more stuff here. We'll try to keep it grounded in realities at your team size and your level, and not touch on how to do things in larger projects or with bigger teams and such. And while this is mainly aimed for the GameLAB teams, I do believe many of the incubator and maybe even accelerator teams can benefit from this as well. We have to go through certain topics quite fast, and in many areas I might be showing you one or two tools that you could use for that particular part of the process. Obviously there's more tools out there that you could use, and we can even talk about, and if some area is such that your team needs more support with that, then book with me one-on-one sessions for your team and we can help. This is first and foremost aimed for the project leads and the people being in the producer type roles. This is very valuable and required mandatory teaching for you, but it's also probably helpful for any team members to understand this better. Why are we doing these things and how are they supposed to help you? Feel free to raise your hand if you have questions or write things in the chat, and we'll try to make this a bit more interactive session. I booked this for an hour and a half. Hopefully we can get through the entire part one today. And if we finish early, then we finish early. But if we run out of time, then we'll continue next Tuesday from where we left off. And these will be later available as videos on the GameCity, Kajaani YouTube channel and other channels where they are normally shared. But give Jones a little bit time to get these online, because I believe he's also in Helsinki today, so it might be a little longer delay than usual. But let's get going. So this is me, not here really to talk about me, but let's just say that over 20 years of game industry experience working on all platforms and multiple games and multiple genres over the years across many companies and many studios in multiple countries. So quite a few things I've done along the years. And these days I run my own company, JR Game Consulting, under which flag I'm here to present to you as well. But I also have a day job, which is at Housemarque, the oldest studio here in Helsinki, still live and kicking. And we are about to launch a game called Saros later this month. You might have heard of it. It's a first-party PlayStation title. But today, I'm talking about things from my perspective and the perspective of JR Game Consulting. So anything that I say is not a reflection on any way to Housemarque or Sony, and I will not be sharing any internal secrets, obviously, but also not representing the company's in any official capacity. So just some of this legal stuff that we need to get out of the way to everybody to know who am I representing. If after this lecture you want to know more about short-term planning and how to run your sprints and stuff, you can take a sneak peek at some of the stuff that we'll be covering later from my last year's lecture. Last year I only had 1 hour to present all of project management to people, so I had to be very selective in what I presented. But it's still worth watching if you have the time, and it's available on the GameCity Kajaani YouTube channel. So feel free to go and watch that, and you can ask questions related to that in future sessions. But today, we're first going to talk about your GameLAB year, and especially Q2, Q3, so the next 6 months, roughly, and what is it going to contain. Then we're going to talk about why do we do project management? What is the purpose of project management? Why should you care about project management? It sounds boring, right? And then majority of today is going to go into discussing how do you build and maintain a product backlog, and we break it down to 4 topics: building it, estimating it, prioritizing it, and then maintaining it. And that's all we're going to cover today. Rest of project management we will cover in the follow-up lectures, which of there is at least 3 more after today. Might be more depending how fast we get through the material and how much interactivity there is in these sessions. So the GameLAB year is really a challenge for you to ship a game in 1 year. From my perspective, that's the #1 goal. I know that the program and Jussi and Klaus have been trying to coach you on how to make the best possible game with the resources you have. From my perspective, I just want you to ship successfully a game. In the last year's GameLAB cohort, most teams failed to ship a game in a year, and we didn't make it clear to them. This puts you in a great place for the future, because the hardest thing about making games is actually shipping it. That last 20% could actually be 80% of the work, and you don't know it until you've gone through it. So don't underestimate the value of having one shipped game under your belt as a team. That puts you in a great place for future as a team to continue building upon that success, no matter what the commercial success or even critical success of that game is. Just shipping a game in itself would be a huge accomplishment for you. So that's my goal for all of you. And we will be a bit tougher on that than last year. I think the program has already communicated that once a quarter, the program and the coaches will evaluate which teams continue in the program. And we start to treat it like a funnel. So the teams that are not responsive to the coaching and are not achieving the program's goals might be eliminated throughout the year, to make sure that the limited resources that the program has goes towards helping the most promising teams. Because ultimately, what the program is trying to help is creation of new companies within the Kajaani region. So Jussi has already talked to you a little bit about what is the year looking like and what is the process cycle of game development. And while I present a slightly different view on it, it is in no way in conflict with that. So you can, for example, watch Jussi's lecture, Introduction to Game Design, if you haven't. These slides are from there. So kudos and credit to the person whose slides I'm borrowing. So far, what you have been doing in bigger terms, we can call pre-production, but we can also break pre-production down into multiple phases within the pre-production, often called concept phase, prototyping, and pre-production phases. And Klaus and Jussi have been your coaches for the first quarter of the year on this. And you have been trying to answer the questions, what are we making, first and foremost, and then, I guess to a little less extent, how are we going to make that game? And that journey will continue in Q2 in the later half of pre-production. But we're going to focus much less on the what are we making. We're more focusing on how are you going to make it. But then also, how much of that kind of game do you have time to make in 6 months? And then actually making it. And then towards the end of this 6-month period, we're going to be crying, or you're going to be crying, because you're going to have to remake things that you made wrong. You're going to be throwing away stuff that you didn't have time to finish. And you're going to be cutting scope, because probably all of you will overscope and overestimate how much you can deliver in 6 months. And my job is to try and minimize that pain and suffering towards the end of that 6 months by being more demanding to you earlier, so that you do your homework and scope your game to match the resources and skill sets you have available, so that you can deliver maybe a tighter scope of a game, but you can still make a quality delivery on that. And then the last 3 months, we are leaving for post-production. Topics like polishing, bug fixing, how do you publish the game, how do you release the game, all of these things are important. And then next year, you're in post-launch, you've launched your first game in some form or another. Some of you will go on to become teams in the incubation program if you're selected. Some of you might be incorporating your team into a company. And the ultimate goal is that you make mucho dinero many euros as a company and building sustainable businesses for yourselves. Another way to look at it is through an example. So how would these phases look like? And I'm just taking a sort of prototypical 3-year AAA console development cycle and comparing it to this year in your project. How could that potentially look like comparatively? So it could be very normal that in the early phases it's less than 30 people and might take like 4 months, which is 12% of the time. You have now spent 3 months on this, which is 25% of the entire time you have to shipping this game. The pre-production production phases, the team starts to scale up. It can lead to 100 or hundreds of people plus outsourcing when you start talking about scales like the games that I'm making with Housemarque. And maybe if we had 3 years to make, we would spend a year on each of these, so about a third of the time. You now have 6 months, which is half of your time. So within similar ballpark, a little less because you spend more of your time percentage-wise in the early phases. And how far are you in pre-production? I don't really know. Some of you might be further along in that than others. And then the last quarter, 3 months, sounds like a lot for post-production, right? But if we take a title, like here, Sony internal studios tend to spend 8 months in all of the post-production period with the reducing team size over time. So that's about 22% of the overall time available spent on that. But the crazy thing is it doesn't necessarily shorten. So even if we make the same game in 2 years, we might still have to spend 8 months in that. That's how heavy the process is for polishing and bug fixing and delivering final quality and printing it on disk and everything else that happens in a professional AAA setting. Of course, live service and digital-only releases work a little differently. But when you look at those comparative sizes, 3 months is not unrealistic to spend on finalizing the game when you're doing it for the first time without the proper support of a dedicated QA teams and such support functions at your disposal. Another way to look at the year is then a cylindrical model or cyclical model. You spent the first quarter on your concept and prototyping phase, and we're now roughly in early April, and you're going to spend the next 6 months in pre-production and production of your game. You should have a sort of solid version of the game done by end of September so that you then have time to finalize the game and push it to market in one form or another before the end of the program year. What you do outside of the GameLAB year is up to you and your team, whether you continue to collaborate or not. And like I said, you might end up in an incubation program or turning into a real company. That's up to you guys and if you accepted those programs. But within this year, we're trying to help you to make sure that you get this at least one game done as a team and shipping it and can feel proud about everything that you've accomplished and learned along the way. So if we then think about that 6 months, how to best use it? At the very highest level of roadmap planning, you have to break it down into some kind of milestones. One example would be to break it into monthly milestones. That would give you about 5 to 6 milestones if you do a milestone each month, which means each milestone is about 15 to 20% of each of the total time that you have available to make this game. And that 6 months is only 26 weeks. So you have to be very deliberate in your choices of what features and what content do you choose to build and what content and features do you choose to cut from your scope that you can guarantee finishing the game before the end of the year. If you don't take that seriously, you will most likely fail to deliver a game by the end of the year, which is what happened to most teams last year. And then you can further break it down to sprints or any shorter cycles, depending on what kind of process you want to follow. I'm teaching you one way of doing it based on Scrum because it's quite easy to learn. And that gives you, I'll answer you in very quickly, Ville. And that gives you about 12 to 13 sprints or about 10% of your total time available for your entire project goes to each sprint. So that gives you a very clear guidance, roughly, to think about how much of your game should you be able to do in a month or in a 2-week period. And that already acts as a first step scoping of, is our scope in any way realistic at all? Yes, Ville. Did you have a question? I can't hear you. If you're speaking, I can't hear you. No. Okay. So yeah, if you want to write your questions, you can write them in the chat. Yes, people can have holidays, vacations during the summer, or they might not. That's up to you as a team. How do you want to spend this year and this coaching that is available to you? That's not up to me to decide, but if you decide to do that, then obviously you have less scope. Some teams might actually get more of their work done during the summer because they don't have school and other distractions, but they can spend a more dedicated time on working on the game. But make sure you have those conversations in your team. How are you planning to utilize that time? Very good point, Bill. Of course, in a professional setting, by law, we have to give people vacations even. But that's a different story. They're not doing a 1-year program in a GameLAB. They're being paid as professionals to be doing this for the next couple of decades. Okay. Why do we need project management? Anybody want to give me a guess or a thought? Why do you think we need project management? It sounds boring, right? The game would be done faster if we just kept programming and making art and not manage the project in any way, right? Anybody? I guess we don't have Riikkalotta here, so it's easier to develop with a plan. Yes, that is a true point. Anybody else have any ideas?
Well, I assume it's very easy to lose focus when there is nobody to say to the team where we are heading. So everybody is just doing their own thing, and then it's just a chaos.
Yes. It's hard to make sure that you work effectively together as a team to make the best possible game if you're not actively managing your project and collaboration some way. So that's why you ultimately, as an individual who wants to make good games that people get to actually play, that's why you should care, because that gives you the best chance to make the best possible game your team is capable of doing while minimizing the pain of time spent, of extra work, especially wasted work that gets thrown away because somebody else didn't have time to do the art for the feature, so the feature can't ship, or because you couldn't fix the bugs from that feature, you have to cut it from the game, or something else that affects. A big part of game development is scoping, and it's a very hard skill. It's both a skill and an art. So the earlier you start practicing that, the better. So if you take your project management seriously as a team, you can make a better game. That's ultimately the main goal of this whole thing, is to make the best game you can make. So why should the team as a whole or a company care beyond that individual feeling of wanting to make the best possible game? Well, obviously the best possible game is going to make more money for the company. Of course, there's many other things that feed into it, timing, marketing, and so forth. But things get easier if you have a better product and you have a well thought out rollout plan for how you're publishing it. But I look at it in terms of these things. You get the things done better, you get them done faster, and you get them done cheaper. And if you can do things faster and cheaper, that means you can do more. So the best way to make sure that you have more time to make more awesome content for your game is to make sure that you take your scoping and project management seriously and minimizing the work that you throw away. That way you can get more stuff into your game that is actually up to quality bar as a player experience. But there's another aspect, which is predictability. It might not be so important right now, but it gives you some predictability as a business to understand how much money do you need, how much time do you need, how many people do you need to make this game. Is the game matching at all our ability to deliver? Because the hard part about game development isn't to come up with good ideas, it is the execution. There's a lot more people with good ideas for a game than there are people who manage to execute them to the level of quality that people are actually willing to spend time and money on those games. Because the problem isn't that there's not enough games. I think I just heard that there's like 16,000 games coming to Steam every year, and 80 games of those make about 80% of the money. Those are rough numbers, but it gives you that ratio. The problem isn't that people don't have enough good games to play. They have plenty of games to play, and many of them are very good. They have to discover those games. And that predictability helps. When is it coming out? What features will it have? How much money do we need when you start treating this as a business in the future? So the earlier you start practicing, how can you do project management well enough for your team needs, the sooner you're going to learn the skill, because nobody knows it from the get-go. It takes multiple iterations. And this year is a real serious chance for you to try to learn that as a team. And it's good to remember that it changes when you change teams. So the way things are done is different in different teams, and different teams have different strengths and weaknesses. So whenever you change teams, you have to go a little bit backwards to learn new things again so that you can function well as a team. And that goes for project management as well. So hopefully you're all motivated now to take project management seriously, because it's going to be key to your success in this program, along with many other things. But it might not be as interesting, and my stuff might not be as interesting as what Klaus and Jussi were telling you, but they are equally important in terms of being a success in this program. So the product backlog. A very simple way to say it is just a list of all the things you are building. Unless you can list all the things you want to build for your game, then there's no way you can manage the scope. You don't even know what scope it is. And people might imagine very different scopes. But why do we need that list? Why am I starting with the list instead of the day-to-day work? What's the why behind a product backlog? Without streamlined vision, the team cannot work as one entity. When it's written out, it's more concrete. Yeah. Yeah. Often when we don't write things down in enough detail, we can imagine it very differently. When we just use some terms, we all are creating images and impressions in our head. What's that mean? But they can mean very different things. Classical examples are like art outsourcing is full of it. You order a mustard bottle from Asia, and then you get back a bottle that's green, and you're like, that's not the color of mustard. Okay, did you make sure that they've ever even seen a mustard bottle? They use a lot of wasabi, for example, and that could be green. So that could be the reason why they interpreted the word mustard completely differently. They maybe used Google Translate, and it just was it's a condiment, it's a spice. Okay, I'll just put a spice bottle. So Writing them down in a way that everybody can understand the same way is a big part of alignment. Everybody probably knows one of these, has played with them as a kid. They're quite universal. To me, this is a very valuable tool, and this is the first tool I'm going to teach you about project management. I call it the project management seesaw. And on one side, you can think of your resources, which to a large extent is the people you have available and the time those people have available to them to make the game. And on the other side, you have the scope that you want to have the game to have and the quality expectation you want to hit with that scope. And those need to always be in balance or your project is in trouble, right? If you have too much scope to do, the seesaw is not in balance. And you have to either add people to the project or more time to the project to get it back on balance. Or on the other side, it could be this way, but that's rarely the case in game development. We can always find ways to add more stuff to the game. And we're talking about time boxing here. The team size multiplied by the time available gives you the sort of person hours, person months, person days, whatever units you want to call, but that gives you the overall time the team has to make the game. So everything, to some extent or another, is time boxed in game development. Unless you're Valve or somebody else with endless budgets, you're always going to be limited by this. Who dares join late? Esa. Oh, Esa probably dropped out. He was here earlier. Welcome back, Esa. So everything at the end of the day is time boxed to some degree or another, because we all have limited budgets. Even when you look at somebody like Housemarque and the huge games we make like Saros or Remedy and Alan Wake that I worked on, we still work within constraints of budgets and resource constraints. Very few and far in between those companies who have limited resources. So for the GameLAB purposes, you can sort of think of your team and the time available fixed. You have 6 months to finish the production of the game, and you have roughly the team that you have. Maybe somebody joins late, maybe somebody leaves, but the base assumption is that the team and the time is fixed. So if your scope and quality isn't in order, you're going to completely break your system, which is probably going to lead to either unfinished game or unpolished game or buggy game or people burning out or some combination of those things. Instead, what you have to do is manage the scope. You can, of course, manage the quality as well, but it's often much more uncomfortable to manage the quality of things. But you can, for example, choose an art direction style that is cheaper to produce, and other ways to manage the quality expectation of the things. Doing a 3D versus 2D can also lessen the quality cost of things. But the most common lever is scoping things down. And that's what a lot of the project management is then focused on how do you manage that scope so that you don't break this seesaw. Hopefully that mental model and this mental tool of how to think about things helps understand what is at the very core of something like this year, where we're telling you that with the team you have, with no budget for outsourcing to buy more people from anywhere, without being able to hire more people necessarily, you have 6 months to make the game. So scope your game accordingly. The earlier you scope, the less time you're going to waste building things that you're going to have to cut from the game because you didn't have time to finish them. So what is the product backlog? We were just talking about why do we need a product backlog and how does it help us? And maybe learn a tool called the seesaw that can help think about these things in visual terms, why we're doing it. Well, I like to often look at dictionary definitions. The infinite wisdom of AI tells us that product backlog is a dynamic, prioritized, evolving list of everything needed to do the product, in our case, the game. and it should be serving as the single source of work. So no work should be done by the team that is not in the backlog. So any work that anybody wants to start doing should be put into the backlog. So we have a full track record of all the work we are doing so that we can prioritize it against other work that could be more valuable. And dynamic is telling us that it's something that is changing over time, which means we need to maintain it. Another way to look at it is a visualization I borrowed from the internet. This gives you an idea what a backlog could look like conceptually. It's a list of items that are in prioritized order, and you can change those priorities over time. You can insert new items, you can delete items that are no longer valuable, and you can refine items by breaking them down in more detail over time. And importantly, a good backlog has estimates, and we have a whole section today to talk about estimates. When you have a good product backlog, it's easy then to pull items from there into your sprint backlog, where you can break them down further into tasks that help you plan that individual sprint or short-term iteration. And it's good to treat these backlogs separately. There's many reasons for it, but the biggest one is that it's easier to maintain the product backlog when you on purpose keep it separate from your sprint backlog, and you treat the sprint backlog items as having much more granularity than your product backlog. So what do you do with this backlog? First, you have to build it, so you have one. Then you need to estimate those items. I already mentioned the estimates in the previous visualization. Then you need to prioritize it so that you have the right things at the sort of top of the backlog. If you think about it as a stack visualization. And then once you've done all of these, you need to maintain it. And those are the four different things we're going to be talking about today. The recommended tool for this program is Hack and Plan. It's a tool commonly used in Comc, and many of you are from Comc, so you might be familiar with the tool. Trey, the other coach, is also familiar with the tool. So every now and then I have this Hack and Plan logo here telling us that, hey, you should be doing this in Hack and Plan. Exactly how? Talk to Trey about the details if you need help with Hack and Plan. I think he has some templates for you and some teaching materials for how to best use Hack and Plan for doing these things. So we have synced on all of these topics with Trey beforehand. I will not be diving into Hack and Plan with you guys. I'm not personally familiar with that specific tool. And in my day-to-day job, I rarely use that level of hands-on tools at the moment, because I'm leading such bigger projects at a more higher level, directional level. So how do we build one of these things? Simply, you list all the things you aim to build. That's the beginning of it. So whatever format you use, whatever your tools you start using, start listing those things. And it's good to remember it's okay to add more later. In fact, you don't want to go too granular too early, because it's going to make the maintenance of it much harder. It's easier to maintain hundreds of items than it is to thousands of items. And even easier if there's tens of items on your list. And so you can imagine if we, on a game like Saros, broke things down too early to very granular level, we would not be able to maintain that size of a backlog. But a little bit more about when to break it down a little later. There's multiple tools that you could do this with, but for the sake of time, I'm going to teach you in each of these sections one or maximum a few selected tools that are relatively easy to use. This is called story mapping or user story mapping. Has anybody heard of this? Maybe in some Agile training in your school or something similar? No? Okay. User stories, yes. So user story in itself is one of these little things here. You can use this overall format with other things than user stories, but user stories makes it relatively easy. The idea here is that you're trying to map out something that the user does in your program, and what things you want to do, what do you have to do to accomplish them, be able to do that. And the horizontal lines are then releases, so you can even plan sort of a release roadmap. And this is one way to visualize your backlog, long-term or short-term. We, for example, did this with post-it notes in one physical room for a product I did earlier in UK, where we had thousands of post-its. And we could visualize the entire vertical slice of the game on that wall for planning purposes, and in what increments were we planning to release it. But user stories often talk about things from a user perspective. So from our perspective, usually, how does a gamer see the feature? Not how do we as developers define the features, but how can we define the things we need to do from the perspective of the user to make sure that the things we're doing tie together into cohesive whole that the player will actually appreciate. Sometimes the customer can be one of the team members. For example, if you're making a tool for your level designers to make levels faster for the game, so then the user might be that person. This is a very simple example how you could do this if you were building a hotel room booking system or an early version of Airbnb. There needs to be a way for the user to find a room and then book a room. So some of the steps that they would do on the white here in the middle, they would answer search criteria and they would browse through the rooms. They would then pick a room and pay for the room. And then what are some of the items from a developer point of view that you actually need to do to enable those user behaviors? And these, again, if these are written in user story format, they can be made more player understandable. But also when they're player understandable, they're also more understandable for all the teams. This is especially important for technical tasks. Programmers love to define their backlog items in a way that only other programmers will understand. And it's very hard then for the team to, for example, understand what dependencies these create, or what should be done first, and what is the priority if they can't understand what the value of those items are for players. That also means that it facilitates teamwork, because each of these items usually requires work from multiple people within the team to actually accomplish to a level that user will evaluate and care for. So this is one tool to visualize and build backlog, but you can use any tool that you're familiar with to try and identify those items that your game will need. You probably have many of them, but doing more systematic exercises like this, you will probably recognize items that you did not think of. Simple things that you tend to forget is like loading screens or some menu selections, or being able to exit out of the game. These sort of things we tend to forget about in our implementation roadmap if we don't use some more formal method to identify all the work that needs to be doing. I already talked about a little, do not break those items too small too early, because you're going to create a maintenance nightmare for you. And this is a visualization, again, something I borrowed from the internet, which relates to your product backlog into an iceberg. There's a little bit at the surface of the ocean that you can see, and then there's this whole huge thing hiding underneath the waves. And sort of how you can think of it at a multiple levels of things that are closer to implementation should be broken down into smaller chunks. But we'll talk more about that in the later sections. So you'll see this graph again. And again, you should be doing all of this ultimately in Hack and Plan, so you can manage your project there. Even if you do the early visualization in Miro or in Post-it notes in the real world or whatever other tools you use, ultimately you want it in some project management tool. And the one we use in this program is Hack and Plan. If you want to use another tool, that's up to you, but then you're not going to get as much support from Shrey and us as coaching team on how to use that tool. Hack and Plan is also free. So we are using only free versions, free features of Hack and Plan, and we're providing you some other templates and tools to help you with the features that would normally cost you money. Any questions on building a backlog? Remember, you can write your questions to the chat at any time, and I'll take a break every now and then and look at them. We also use post notes as a rule. We usually start our user stories with a template. Yes, so that's a very common user story template. Make sure that you use that language, then it's easier to remember those things. A very good format to use. But you can Google user stories and you can find a lot more information about different formats and how to use them. All right, let's move to estimations. Why do we need to bother estimating the items in our backlog? Sounds like a lot of boring work. You'd rather be doing design and art and programming than putting numbers against some items, which ultimately are probably not going to be exactly accurate anyway. But why do we do it? Dennis, you have the right answer. I have faith in you. Well, we are trying to predict what you can do in that given time. Remember, everything's time boxed, right? This program, you have 6 months, you have your team size. The better you can predict how much you can do, the more time you can focus on the right things and less waste you're going to have that's going to get thrown away. By cutting your scope early to fit the time you have, you can make a better game and less wasted work. It's good to remember two concepts related to this. One is projection and one is commitment. Projection to me means a best effort estimation of the future. And a commitment is a promise to deliver. First and foremost to your teammates, but later to your company and your project. But in your situation, I want you to treat commitments and projections separately for very good reasons. So this is called a cone of uncertainty. It's one of multiple visualizations. But the idea here is that each of these new cones in dotted lines is the beginning of a new sprint. And after every sprint, you have learned a little bit more about building a chunk of your game, and you will adjust your course accordingly. And there's this certain level of unknown. Wait, what exactly is going to be the game? I've never worked on a game that shipped exactly as imagined in the beginning. There's always discoveries, and the game sort of teaches you along the way how to make it better. And you have to be adjusting your plans accordingly. That's why we like to use mostly agile processes in game development these days, because it allows us that ability to react to the game that is emerging from the work. I want you to treat the milestone, the sprint that you're about to start as a commitment. You make a commitment to your friends and you do everything in your power to deliver what you promised. That teaches you then that rigor of taking project management in terms of sprint planning seriously. And if that means you have to work a little extra that sprint and you can do it, then please try to do it. Just make sure that then in the next sprint you load a little less work on yourselves so that you don't keep burning yourself out by working too hard. Find the sustainable pace. Challenge the team to find the sustainable pace by always treating that short-term iteration as a commitment that you will do everything in your power to hit, but treat everything beyond it as a projection. And after every time you deliver a piece of software, you have a chance to reevaluate your roadmap and cut scope further if you're not on schedule. And the tool, probably the most controversial tool in terms of some people just hate it because they don't understand it. But my recommendation, even though it's advanced technique, even for many professional game developers, is to use relative estimations for your estimates on your backlog level, not in your sprints, but on your backlog level. And the reason I recommend it is that I find that once you learn how to do it, it's faster, it takes less work, and it's self-correcting to some degree, so that the inaccuracies of your estimations don't matter as much. And we'll talk more about that when we get into sprint planning in the second or third lecture of how does that relate to the backlog planning. So the classical example of relative estimation is t-sort sizes. And I actually have worked with studios that use t-sort sizes as the first version of their estimates, even if they do more accurate estimates later, just to get a first rough idea of the sizes and complexities of items. And you then often on the background translate them to numbers. This is just one set of numbers you could use so that you can do math with them, because it's hard to do math with t-shirt sizes. It starts ending looking like Roman numerals and nobody can follow which Super Bowl is running this year because the number gets so complicated. But it could be anything. It's really an arbitrary thing. This is an often used example in Agile circles of vehicle points. These could all be points to reflect different vehicles, and you could be using these vehicles to estimate relative sizes of these things. Sounds very vague and confusing, I know, but it's actually easier than it seems, and it's actually more valuable than it seems because it saves so much time. I like to use, and many other people like to use, the Fibonacci sequence, which is a brilliant sequence of numbers. People who grew up in Turku usually know this because there's a famous building in Turku which at least used to have this sequence on its wall. And programmers should know it. There's the formula how you calculate it. It's pretty easy. You start with 0 and 1 and you always keep adding the last two numbers together. And you get this number that keeps growing in size, which is very valuable quantity of this sequence or quality of the sequence for our purposes. It's also everywhere in nature if you start looking. So it is somewhat of a magical number, and that's why many people like to use it. But most people actually use what is called an adjusted Fibonacci sequence. We don't follow the full sequence. This is an example of it, and this is actually a product you can buy that many people manufacture. That one is done by Mountain Goat Software, and I have here a version that we use at Housemark, which has these same cards and a few extras. And so we put some other numbers in there outside of the Fibonacci sequence. And the big reason is that the difference between 21 and 34, let alone going further, is much less relevant than the size difference between 1 and 2. So at a certain point, using Fibonacci sequence is just more work than it's worth. And that's why we usually use 1 to 13 from the Fibonacci sequence for its mathematical formula of how it grows. And then we go to even numbers. Maybe whether you use 20, 40, and 100, or 20, 50, and 100, or 25, 50, and 100, doesn't really matter. And on the other end, we like to use a half and a 0 to indicate very small things. And sometimes we even use the infinity symbol, indicating that we can't really estimate the size and complexity of this task yet. And because we use this sometimes for planning poker purposes, this deck, we also have the question mark where the person in the planning poker can express the concept that they don't know. So they're not forced to pick a number. If you don't know what planning poker is, Google it. It's a good way for team collaborative estimation. And what you then want to do to help you do these to large numbers of backlog items is that you build something that I called relative estimation tool. This is one example of it using a limited Fibonacci sequence, but you can use it with any number set. You just have that horizontally there at the top of what is the numbers you want to use, and then you pick some items from your backlog and you map them against this. You only usually need like 6 to 12 items here, maybe even 3 is enough. Maybe not, but let's say 6 is probably enough. And you have 6 representative items well enough spread across this thing. You can then just use this as a visual reference to go through a bunch of items in your backlog and start putting out numbers, what sizes they are. And if it then turns out later that you go through your backlog, you start to go, wait a minute, that 5 isn't really a 5, it's more like a 13. Feel free to adjust it. And if you have the time, even go through your backlog again using the new relative tool. Using a tool like this, we managed to go through thousands of Post-it notes in a physical room in a couple of hours. The amount of work that done with actual time estimates, the way people usually do time estimates, would have taken the team probably weeks to do, right? And from a project management perspective, the way we then managed the project, we made sure that those numbers were just as valuable for us. And in fact, we ended up delivering the entire vertical slice. And I was only off by 4 days over 6 months estimation, using only the relative numbers. So it can be a very valuable tool that saves you a lot of time if you learn how to use it. I know the beginning is hard because it just doesn't make any sense in the way that quantum mechanics or fuzzy logic doesn't make any sense until you really dive into those. And you've already seen this graph. So how does this relate then to those estimation sizes? Well, I already said that you only want to break down items in granular detail that are close to getting implemented, because if you break them out too early, you're just gonna do work that might not be useful, because the whole thing might be cut from the game because you didn't have time, or you're trying to estimate a thing you don't know enough about yet, and things just go old and stale. So to make your maintenance easier, use the big end of your numbers spectrum at the long-term planning stages of your backlog. Then use the mid-range of your numbers for the current release. So if you have, for example, a 1-month milestone, and then use really small numbers only for the next couple of sprints that you're preparing for your sprint planning. If you do this, then your sprint plannings get easier without increasing the overhead of the backlog maintenance too much. And again, once you've done your number range, you should be able to put all of these numbers for each backlog item in your hack and plan tool. All right, any questions on the estimations? In work environment, we need estimations to understand if we can stand within our resources and schedule. Yes. In GameLAB environment also, you have limited time and resources. And casino players know these numbers by heart. Yeah, I don't gamble. I get addicted enough to just video games. So I could only imagine the damage if I started gambling. Do you take account 30% buffer for those estimations? You don't need to, you can, but relative estimates actually build in buffers on their own. That's one of the reasons we don't allow all the numbers to be used, right? You might be really tempted to use the number 4, but okay, if you think it's bigger than 3, you have to say 5, and now you already built in some buffer in there. So this actually obfuscates the buffer in there as well. And that's useful in corporate environment because business people hate buffers. They want the project to be as fast, as cheap as possible. So they force you to cut all the buffers out of your project. And then they're very mad when the projects are late and over budget, because nobody can fully predict the future. You need those buffers. And this is one of the ways to sort of hide the buffers from the CFOs and the financial business people who only manage businesses through Excel spreadsheets. Hopefully they don't watch this video, so they don't learn this trick. I also think that it is quite okay to revisit your estimations during the development. Sometimes tasks are harder or easier than expected, and it might affect the schedule of other tickets. Absolutely. It is okay. However, it is, again, a lot of work. I talked a little bit about how relative estimates can be self-correcting. So sometimes it's not worth updating those. Instead, what we do is we follow the velocity. How fast do we go through items? and we use the average velocity as an estimation for how much work should we be pulling into the next sprint. So if you're clearly off in your relative estimates, yeah, by all means, update it. But you don't have to feel obliged to update all of the estimates all the time if you use velocity estimation to help you plan your sprints. But of course, like many things in life, the more work you put into your backlog maintenance, the better your backlog is. But there's definitely a law of diminishing returns hits in at some point. So at certain point, putting twice as much time into your backlog maintenance isn't going to make your backlog twice as good. It maybe makes it 10% good, better. And at a certain point, it's just like, this is not the best use of our limited time, because it's competing for the time with the actual implementation. Because the same people doing the work are usually the ones estimating the work. So you have to find the balance there. And you can only learn that by experience. Okay, let's move on to prioritization. I'm going to be asking you again why. I'm a big believer in why. We need to understand why are we doing things so that we are motivated to do them, and we understand where we can cut corners and where not. Why do you think we want to prioritize the backlog? I assume, Dennis, that at your work you prioritize your backlog somehow. Has anybody ever given you a reason why you're doing it? Or anybody else? So in marketing, you prioritize KPIs, ROIs, and so forth. Yes. But why do you prioritize the KPIs and ROIs? That's the lens you're using. That's the criteria for prioritization. But why do you want to know what items affect KPIs and ROIs more? In order to figure out needs to be done first before some other items. Yes. It helps structure chaotic list tasks into something more understandable, so whole team can understand what's the direction of the project. Yes. When we run out of time, cut off less necessary stuff. Yes. You will always run out of time on every single project. There's never infinite time unless you go work for Val. To make sure everyone sees the same vision. Yeah, these are all valid points. You want to make sure that you're working on the most valuable things first, because you never get to do everything on your backlog. I don't think there's ever been a game that's finished with every item on the backlog done. Some of those backlog items might be due post-launch as we add more features to a live game, or we pull DLCs or sequels out, but never ever has any game team finished everything on their backlog. Make planning for sprints easier. If you have them in the right order of priority, it's quite easy for you to know what you want to put into the next sprint. You don't have to search through your entire list to figure out what should we be breaking down and planning into more things. And already talked about how you only want to refine your high priority items that are coming up for implementation next, because that keeps the you from potentially spending a lot of time refining and estimating things that you never get to even do. And so your maintenance of your backlog is less effort, with still getting the full benefits of it. So the priorities help on all levels, and ultimately it's all about making the best game possible with the time and resources available, right? We've seen this visualization as well. We talked about how these things need to be estimated, how they need to be prioritized, and there's a little bit about refining. These are all the things you need to be doing with your backlog. And like we said earlier, if you have these things in the right priority order and you've broken those items in green more into detail, it's relatively easy for you to then take those into your sprint planning and start breaking them down into even more granular tasks. Remember, the things on the left are things you're going to be predicting. On things on the right, you want to be committing to. You're promising your teammates that you will deliver these tasks and these items. And then you will do your utmost best to actually deliver those. So the priority in this backlog visualization, the higher the priority, the higher in the pyramid they are. They're sort of floating at the surface. Well, what are the things we look at when we are thinking about priorities? We are looking at things like value. How valuable are they for the product? What is the cost? How expensive is it to do? Can also be a reason to prioritize something higher or later. Risk. The riskier it is, the more unknowns there are, the more we need to do so we can learn more about the game or limit the tech risk or some other implementation risk. The earlier you should probably do it and the higher priorities you should have. But if it's really low value and high risk, maybe you don't want to do it at all. Maybe it should be very low on priority. So these all need to be taken into account one way or another. And knowledge. What knowledge do we gain as a team about our game and about ourselves and ability to make this game if we do this task? And it can affect other things later in the project. So again, there are many, many methods for prioritization. And we would be here for hours, if not weeks, if I tried to teach you all of them. Instead, I'm going to teach you a couple. The things marked green and orange in the graph, we're going to talk about those. So we're going to start from the simple ones. I leave the more complicated ones for you to self-study if you don't find those useful. I'm not saying that you have to use any of these methods, but you're going to have to use some method for prioritizing your things. These could be helpful to you. And again, if you want to learn more about these methods, we can have one-on-one coaching sessions with your team to dive deeper into any of them or all of them. That depends on what you want to be doing and learning. So I'm not telling you you have to use these 5. You can pick one, you can use multiple, or you can use something else. But these are some tools that I will teach you, just like in the previous sections. I'm trying to give you at least one tool in each of these areas what to use. We talked about the seesaw, we talked about story mapping, and we've talked about relative estimations. Those are all tools you can use, irregardless of what your process is or what project management tool you're using. Those are all usable in any situation, or they could be replaced by other tools. So a good concept is this 2D 2x2 matrix, or in Finnish we often call it nelikenttä. It's anything that you can put 2 axes against each other, going from low to high, and then that breaks your things down into 4 different quadrants, and then you can map your things on this visually. Usually it's so that the highest priority items go into the right top corner and the lowest priority in the left. But there are variations. It really depends on your axis. So you can define your own. How cute is it and how fluffy is it? Could be your prioritization axis if that's really important for your game. So you can design your own matrices. But I'll show you a couple of matrices that are commonly used. This is one. And it was in the graph that you saw earlier. Value complexity matrix. So here we have high value, high complexity at the top corner. High value, low complexity, because the complexity is on this axis and that business value is on this axis. So it's relatively easy to understand that the most likely implementation order that you should be prioritizing things in your backlog then is like this. You start with the top right, you go to the blue, then to the yellow, and then to the red items in your prioritization. It might be that you never do those red items. You just completely cut them from the backlog to begin with, or you keep them in your backlog in case there's room for them later. Eisenhower matrix is a very famous one. You might have heard of Eisenhower. He was the president of US, and before that he was Supreme Allied Commander during the Normandy invasion in World War II. And that's looking at things in terms of importance and urgency. Sometimes we mix those two things. Something can be very urgent and we feel we need to do it immediately, but it's not important in the big scale of things. And if we only pay attention to urgent things, we sometimes neglect the important things that are not urgent. So in this case, the B quadrant. And this can be valuable look at prioritization sometimes in some circumstances. And again, the prioritization flows from top right to the bottom left, like that, usually. Sometimes you want to go A, C, B, D instead. But A and D are pretty clear, but the B and C, there's debate which one would go first. And that really depends on your circumstances and those items. But at least you're then having that dialogue when you're trying to figure that out within the team. Impact effort matrix is another example. What's the impact to the business or to the game, and how much effort is it to do? So obviously, if it's low impact to the project, why are we even doing it if it's a lot of work to do? So here, maybe it should be like this, or maybe it should actually be filler tasks and then time sinks. Again, how do you prioritize depends on you. But having that lens, now that I think of it, this doesn't make sense to me. I would prioritize them this way. Major projects, quick wins, filler tasks, and then time sinks. But as you can see, this is quite flexible tool, and there's multiple ways you can use it to prioritize things, using whatever axis find valuable to you. So it's a very customizable prioritization tool and quite simple to use. We used story mapping earlier to build our backlog. You can also use it for prioritization. So it can be a visualization you might want to maintain next to your hack and plan backlog throughout the project, because how you prioritize them on this order and how do you split these releases is a prioritization tool in this same tool. And it's a very user-centric prioritization tool. Moscow is very commonly used, sometimes just as the first stab at prioritization, just like t-shirts were for estimation, before using a more robust thing, because it's quite simple to use. And in the graph earlier, they classified it as an intermediate, but I actually think it's more simple to use than many of those 2x2 matrices are. You start with the must-haves that you absolutely have to have in your product. Then you do the should-haves, then the good ones, and the won't-haves, you explicitly saying that we should not do these at all, at any point in the project. Sometimes it's very valuable to say out loud what we will not do, because it saves us time and money over time. Kano model is very valuable, but quite advanced, and I'm not going to dive deep into this. But if you're doing competitive research on titles in your genre, then you can start identifying different features specific to that genre that fall into these different color categories. And the idea is that the level of execution and what category do you classify the feature in defines how good you need to make that feature for your game to be successful. And the Kano's idea was researching multiple products across multiple industries is that you have to have some set of all of these features. If you only have basic features in your product, no matter how good you make them, people are not going to buy your game. You have to have those green and blue features in your game as well. So this starts to tie the prioritization into your feature set and competitive research against other titles in your genre. And that's why I could give 1-hour lecture just on this. But if you're interested in learning more about this method, we can have a one-on-one coaching session with your team to dive deeper into this particular method. Or you can do your own online research, of course. It takes you time, but it can be done. So again, you want to think of all of these 4 aspects and use one or multiple different prioritization tools to figure out what the priorities are for your backlog. It makes your life easier and your game better. And then you want to do the high priority items first, and you do the low priority items last, if not at all. And just like re-estimation, reprioritization is something you can do over time. If I would have to pick which one do I spend more time on, re-estimation or reprioritization, I would spend more time on reprioritization. Because every feature you add to the game is a new version of the game after every sprint. You can play test it, you learn more about your game, and the game is telling you how to make it better. So I would spend more time reprioritizing the backlog rather than re-estimating the backlog in your maintenance. All right, so again, you can use other tools to support Hack and Plan, but you should be doing this in Hack and Plan to maintain your project. And before we go into the last big topic category of the day, why do we need to do maintenance? Why do we want to maintain our backlog? If you've been listening to me carefully and taking everything in, many of the answers are already mentioned today. Come on, Dennis, you have the answers. To clean unnecessary stuff, yep, definitely. Clean up, prioritize, optimize. Yes, indeed. If you maintain your backlog well, if it's prioritized, if it has good estimates, if you break items down at the right time, your sprint plannings become much easier, but you can pull things from the top. Ultimately, that means you can make the best game possible with the time and resources you have available, because the team is focusing on the highest priorities for the emerging game. By breaking down and refining items regularly, you spread the work over time, and the closer you do that breakdown to actual implementation, the more likely you're going to do it well. The more you know about the game, the more you can delay that work, the better. But of course, if you have only one big item, do the game, and it's infinite, that doesn't give you any predictability. So you have to find the right balance. And that means maintenance needs to be a regular thing. It might not be described as a thing in the basic Scrum requirements of the main process, but any team that implements Scrum or other Agile processes inevitably end up putting some sort of backlog maintenance ceremony into their process. And we're going to talk more about that in the future lectures, how to incorporate all of this into Scrum. So again, this is all the things you are doing in your maintenance. You are creating new items. You are breaking down big items to smaller items. You are reprioritizing those. You are changing those estimates potentially. That's all, and deleting items. That's all part of what you do in the maintenance. That's it. It's like gardening. If you only cut your bushes once every 10 years, you're going to ruin your bushes or your apple trees. It's much better to cut a little bit every year so that they keep producing the berries and the fruits. So you want to be refining your backlog. You want to be estimating your backlog and prioritizing it, and again refining. And this cycle keeps on going for as long as your studio exists. Because if you don't do this on this game project, then you're going to start another game project and you're going to keep doing this. So better embrace it and get good at it so that you spend that time effectively and get a lot of value out of it, because you're going to be doing a lot of it. So if we think about a Scrum cycle, this is one visualization of it, again, borrowed from internet. We often call it grooming or backlog maintenance or backlog grooming. It happens, in my view, it should happen every sprint. So for every sprint, you should bake in one of those grooming sessions, because that way the workload stays relatively easy. If you only do it once every 3 months, the workload is immense, because it's like if you clean your house, bit of vacuuming every week and bit of dusting every week, it never gets to accumulate to a point that it's going to take your entire weekend just to clean one room. But if nobody cleans anything for a long time, the workload piles up. So the less painful way of doing backlog maintenance is to do it more often in smaller chunks. I've had teams where we do a little bit of backlog maintenance every single week, and it keeps the backlog healthy, it keeps the project healthy, it makes the sprint planning easier, and it ultimately breaks down the less fun stuff in smaller chunks throughout the calendar year, and it's less painful to do. So when we talk about backlog, we're talking about the grooming part and the product backlog part. And all these other parts you see here are all part of this basic agile process that we're going to go through in the upcoming lectures over the next month or so, one by one. And I'm going to teach you at least one tool for each of these things, how to do it. And I'm not dictating that you have to use all of these tools that I'm teaching you, but you have to do every one of these things in this loop to some degree with some tools to be successful. So, for example, relative estimations. You do not have to do estimations, but you have to do estimations. You don't have to use the Eisenhower matrix to prioritization, but you have to do prioritization. Otherwise, you will not succeed in the GameLAB. All right, that is the content for today. Pretty well accurately estimated hour and a half. We have 8 minutes left. Next time, in part 2, we will be diving into sprints. So a lot of this is about the sprint. We spend a lot of time on the backlog because it's a complicated thing that is often not taught as part of things. They just say, oh, run your sprints like this. Oh, and then you should have a backlog. So we spend the entire time on a backlog based on the feedback I got from last year's incubation teams and from some of the teams in the one-on-one coaching already this year's batch that had a lot of questions on how to actually do this backlog thing, because it seemed like magic. So hopefully it's a little less scary and intimidating. It's not that hard as it might seem at first. It just requires constant work that might not always be so fun. But if you do it well and you do it often, it gets less painful over time because the work doesn't accumulate into a big mess on the backlog side. Thank you. That was today's presentation.